Hey guys, Steve Moran here. You just recently completed a really interesting survey about caregiving, and that's primarily what we're going to dig into. But before we get there, let's talk a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Yeah, so my name is Chia-Lin Simmons. I'm the CEO of LogicMark. LogicMark is a public company in the OTC, and we have been in the medical alerts and healthcare remote monitoring business since, I guess it would be going back to 2005. I joined the company in June of 2021 to actually help pivot the company from more of a hardware company to a connected care AI-enabled technology company that's in sort of the medical alerts and health remote monitoring care business.
Terrific. And so I guess so you did this survey. Talk to me a little bit about the survey, and then I want to get into why you did it.
Yeah, so this survey had gone out to basically 1,500 people, and it really covers, it's really part of two sort of national surveys. This first part of which is really focused on, aging, caregiving, and conversations that we are really having. And so, and we are doing this because, we are a human-centric technology company, which means that we are trying to build technology that basically services the need of people who are out there living their lives, trying to build technology that fits their needs versus trying to have them adapt to the technology we've built. And so with that in mind, it actually means that we really reach out and want to learn a heck of a lot more about our customers, probably more than a typical sort of startup with a ticker symbol. And so we went out there to really try to understand what's going on in the world of caregiving and the people that are receiving care. And so this has been sort of a really great opportunity. It validated some things that we really did understand, but also I think highlighted a lot of things that were not what we thought as well.
Okay, terrific. Well, let's talk a little bit about some of the findings, and I'm going to sort of let you drive. I've got your press release here, and so I may have some additional questions. So let's just start with kind of what your findings are, and I've got a lot of thoughts on this because, as you know, I am as running as well as leading Foresight. I also am a caregiver, and it seems like every week something comes up.
Yeah. I mean, I think that we've, in sort of the ether, in the world that we live in today, everybody really understands that there is, in fact, a burnout crisis for caregivers. And I think that's really, to a certain extent, not so much of a surprise, but perhaps what's really more surprising is the percentage of the burnout, because I think that it's very easy when we talk about things in media, and we talk about it in generalities, and we put things in terms of, specific stories about specific people, and that's absolutely true and important. But numbers are really crystallizing when we talk about things related to the burnout crisis. And so, 90% of active caregivers are showing burnout symptoms. That's 90%. That's humongous, right? And it's a generational emergency hiding in plain sight. And so what I mean by that, so when we look at this, when we talk about this 90% of people, it's not just a little bit, right? We're really talking about like 63% of them having really active burnout, experiences and symptoms. And 20% of the people are saying that their burnout is severe. And when we look at the generational crisis and aspects of that, Gen Z, in fact, was the emergency hiding in plain sight. And so typically when people think about caregiving and, the role being a caregiver, perhaps they're thinking about people like myself, the Gen Xers of the world, or even the millennials, right? However, actually, what has emerged from the surveys that we're seeing is that, in fact, Gen Z caregivers that aged 18 to 27 are emerging to represent really 19% of the caregiving population. And what's really sort of interesting here is that for them, the crisis is severe. And it's severe because 47% of them talk about, always, being a caregiver actually always or often cuts into their work time in the prime working years of 18 to 27, for example. And 43% of them say, they are always or often, it cuts into their personal relationships, again, at a time between 18 and 27 when they're building all of those personal relationships that matter. And 58% of them are saying that, they are in fact active caretakers. And we're talking about, taking care of somebody at home, every day. Right. So, and that's really something that was quite surprising to somebody, even for myself, that's, somebody who's actively working in this category space, that Gen Z was experiencing some of the harder burnouts.
So I'm going to be a cynic here a little bit. So I'm a boomer. I'm right in the middle of the boomer. I'm a caregiver today. My stepfather's in a senior living community, but he lived with us when he had fairly significant cognitive decline in his Alzheimer's for a year, where we had the only real help. We were able to bring in some help when we needed to go away for a weekend. We had some hospice care that came in, but we really did it all. And as you were talking about all this burnout and the symptoms of burnout, and maybe we ought to spend a little time talking about what those are, is I'm thinking it's hard. It was always hard. It was consuming, but would I have described myself as burned out? And the answer is probably no. So I know this is sort of a long way of getting there, and I'm going to throw a whole bunch of stuff at you to respond to. And then I'm looking at it and I'm thinking, oh man, these Gen Zs they need to buck up and be tougher about it, because life is hard. And this is part of life. And frankly, I hear this from senior living operators, that they sort of look at the new workforce and think that, I don't know, they're not tough enough. They don't try hard enough. I'm saying this as Jada, who's producing the show, is behind the scenes. And you're Gen X, are you not? Yeah, is that right? What are you, a Gen? No, she's typing it. Huh?
I'm a Gen X. Yes.
Okay, you're a Z. So okay. So
I'm an Xer. So I'm not a Gen Z.
Okay. So I guess, do they just need to get tougher, or talk to me about all this?
Yeah. So, I think that generationally speaking, I think things have shifted quite a lot in the world that we live in. I'm very empathetic towards the Gen Zers. My daughter is on the young end. She's 18, as the younger part of the Gen Z sort of population. And so they do actually have like much of us, maybe, we've gone through sort of ups and downs, but they are facing what seems to be quite a lot of change within sort of the, economic uncertainties of work, opportunities that's available. And certainly I think, even as a Gen Xer, housing is much, much more expensive, in terms of affordability, and certainly going to university and all of that is a heck of a lot more by fathoms, right? And so I think that their financial toll that they're taking, the opportunity availability for the Gen Zers out there is a lot potentially more unstable. And so they're really trying to juggle that prime time of 18 to 27 of actually having to take care of caregiving, which is really fascinating to me, right? Because as a Gen Xer, I'm really probably in the prime of what one would consider in the caregiving sort of like sandwich generation. And so the fact that actually this sort of caretaking is moving down further into a Gen Zer says a lot about, the delays in people having children, where, the gap between your aging parents and the children that's taking care of them probably is a larger gap than it happened before. My mother had me at 24. I had my child at 34, right? And so that, I think, also changes the dynamic a lot, where that prime working years didn't necessarily hit when I needed to take care of aging parents as well as taking care of a child at the same time.
And you make a really good point, because I've been a caregiver in my 60s, and my daughter will be I probably at least 10 years away from needing significant care, but she'll be in her 50s when she would do that. And you've got these younger people who are in their 20s and 30s. Trust me, I would have been a terrible caretaker when I was that age, right? And I can't even imagine how disruptive it would have been to my life to do that. Let's talk for just a minute about what the symptoms of burnout are and what you're actually seeing.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, we don't have the details of what, the symptoms look like out of the survey. But what we do understand is that when we go and ask them, like, what does it mean to have burnout and the severities of it, is that what was quite telling is, only 10% talked about that they're able to balance. While you mentioned like, yeah, we were able to balance it. We kind of sucked it up a little bit. It's certainly, 27% of them said it was mild, but the fact that like 43% said it was moderate and 20% of them said it was severe, I suspect that, really what they're referring to is that when they talk about this burnout, it's about the hidden costs around this sort of other section of the survey, which is around the hidden cost around financial and career tolls, right? That because you have to take time out of caregiving, what is the impact on your career and on your financial goals that you would like to have and establish as your family? And so when we talk about that and when we talk about the burnout, most likely they're also referring to this aspect of financial impact. 73% of them, which is quite overwhelming, report a large or moderate impact on their financial stability because of caretaking, right? As well as 68% talking about large or moderate impact on career flexibility. And so because you have to caretake, but you don't have the opportunity to perhaps pick up and go where there's more opportunities, or, you cannot take a more a promotional opportunity that would take more time out of your schedule. And so that impact is fairly significant. And I suspect that part of that discussion around burnout is tied to that as well. And most importantly, who's carrying the burdens, right? Because arguably, if you look at female caregivers, they earn less on average as well. And they're more likely also at 53% to be future caregivers as well. And so that toll really actually has significant impact, I think, mentally as part of that burnout.
Yeah, I think that's it's really an important issue. When you talk about this, do you have any demographic information in terms of are these caregivers mostly college educated, early career, are they high school, or did you look at that?
We actually did not ask that as part of the survey. Okay. And I certainly think that as we hope to try to do this, on an annual basis, and I would love to go back and really sort of tease those portions out. Yeah. But what I would say is that, again, I think that's a very interesting sort of aspect to, look at. And arguably one of the areas, where it might speak to part of that, which is if perhaps you are, possessing a little bit more wealth and you're able to help your care receivers into a senior community or facility, you would think that in fact that would actually lift the burdens a little bit more because there's somebody who is actually able to sort of look at the day-to-day, and so that would be easier. But and potentially arguably sort of speaking to like some level of capability from a wealth perspective to sort of support that. But the reality is that in fact, actually, that actually doesn't, people still remain fairly anxious about that. And so in fact, moving to a facility doesn't resolve the worry for, the caregivers at all either. Yeah. And so they're worried about, they're alleviating part of the sort of burnout and, mental costs, but they're worried about the care costs, becoming much higher and having to deal with family members receiving care, about worrying about losing their privacy and, and still worrying about having not enough support, which is very interesting because one would think that, if you have the wealth and capability to put, somebody's care into a facility, that would be alleviated. But in fact, that does not seem to be the case necessarily at all.
Yeah. Well, and I think that, if you have a higher income and you've got some wealth there, one of the things that comes with that is you sort of have a higher expectation for your career. And one of the big shifts that we're seeing is, I'm sure this, is that being a college educated white collar worker, particularly younger, is more, perhaps more difficult right now than it's ever been. We've got demographically, we've got too many people with college degrees right now, and then piling onto that is AI, which, you know, initially it's like AI is not going to take away jobs. Well, now we're seeing stories every day that AI is replacing people, and so the pressures are just enormous. So now that we've sort of depressed our entire audience with all this bad news here, is there any good news? How do we make this better?
Well, I think one of the things that was an interesting discussion and surprise, perhaps, is the idea of technology perception and capabilities, right? I think we have all gone into these discussions thinking, you know, those that are being careful are typically the boomers that are turning 65 and over, and perhaps even the greatest generation that's also part of the aging population, are absolutely fearful of technology, and therefore, you know, technology would not alleviate the burdens of that. And perhaps even the older Gen Xers and the younger boomers are a little bit afraid of using technology as a caregiving gap stop, right? But in fact, actually, what was really great about the survey coming back was that this was actually not the case at all. In fact, 92% of caregivers are 100% comfortable, or 92% of them comfortable with technology, which is actually great, right? Because if you really have to use technology and want to use technology to actually enhance your caregiving experience, then there's a certain level of comfort, and that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I think among my generation of Gen Xers and the youngers and the millennial and Gen Zers, this is the generation of health hacking. They're wearing the Aura rings, they're wearing the Fitbits and Apple Watches. And so the idea of remote patient monitoring and health monitoring is not foreign to them. And so the application of that into caring for their senior members of their family doesn't seem to be a difficult sort of leap. But where the leap everybody was concerned about was, what about the boomers and the greatest generation, and how comfortable are they to have, remote care and like patient monitoring? And in fact, 87% of them are actually very confident in using smartphones and apps and all the technology, and feel comfortable with technology for safety features and detection. And so that was really sort of a fantastic news to have and to see that, in fact, this sort of data that we were afraid that was going to come back and say, look, only 30% of them or 20% of them are comfortable with tech, in fact, is just not true at all, right? And so that, I think, was very good news. And I think one would really want to sort of talk a little bit more about what could be, I think, good news in terms of the care gap, the care conversation gap. And so to me, I think we all know that, and theoretically speaking, we all know that having conversations about, aging at home and what happens if I'm, getting sick and older, and what does that mean in terms of my family and the burdens of that, is a concern. And certainly with the caregiver burnout, the data would indicate that the caregivers feel like those receiving care, their loved ones, don't understand, right, the burden that is upon them. And in fact, I think what's nice to see here in terms of the data is that those receiving care at 74% really do spend time thinking about the impact on their family. So this is not a gap that cannot be. The idea that like, oh, my aging parents just don't understand that the burden that they are placing on me, and all of that, this is not in fact true. That 74% of them are really thinking about that. And, that in fact, they have thought about whether or not they're going to sort of age at home. So understanding this, that this is actually in fact true, opens up opportunities, right? Really, what we want from this data is not so much that it's teasing out bad news, and so therefore bad news is bad news. But what I think the survey is great at is to point out, like, look, your loved ones know that, this is their care is a significant impact on the family. And so what a wonderful opportunity to have that conversation, because even though 74% of care recipients know and think and understand that there's impact on their family, and 40% of caregivers name, sort of caregiving as a concern and worry, only 19% of them are having conversations. And I see this 19% as a good news opportunity, because only 19% of us are having conversations about something that worries both sides, right? And so we can do so much better here. And I think that's the good news, is that there's cares and concerns and everybody's worried, and only 19% of us are having that conversation, and we can do better. And what this shows is that everybody wants to have, everybody has concerns. Everybody wants to talk about it. Only 19% of us are doing it. So let's do more.
So I like this so much. I'm 71, so I know that there's going to come a time faster than I care to admit that my kids are going to have to be more involved in caregiving. And on the legal aspect, which we've already spent a lot of time on that, we've done the trust and will stuff. We've spent some time talking about advanced directives and those kinds of things. And I think about my parents who both passed. And even though I'm in the business of the elder care and aging and that kind of thing, my mom had a stroke, and so hard to have that conversation. But my dad was very cognizant, really, up to the day he passed away. And there were a lot of things I wish I'd talked to him about, that sort of in stuff. I mean, the mechanics of it were all fine, but just sort of the income. What's it feel like, and how and he was much more open to talking about it. It's all on me. I mean, the day before he died, he called me up on the phone at 10 o'clock in the morning, and he said, I said, "Hi, Dad," and it was like, "I think today's the day." And he didn't say that I'm going to die, but I knew that's what he meant. And and the next didn't quite get it right. It wasn't until the next day that he passed, and I look back and I think, man, what an opportunity to really talk about some of these things. So I think the message is for the older people to bring it up, for the younger people to bring it up, and that it's worthwhile. But it's scary, right?
It's scary, and this is also exactly the reason why we should have those discussions, and have them early, and have them frequently, and not about the conversation of dying, right?
Right.
But this really affords us, when we talk about the care conversation gap, is about how do we go about the discussion of living and flying, right? I mean, the reality is that if we started having these conversations at 60 and 65, we could talk about how we want to live and live more fully, and what does it mean to basically implement a plan so that we can live our very full best lives, right? And that could mean living at home, but having this technology early so that we can feel like we have a little bit of what we always call here at LogicMark, a little bit of a safety net so that we can fly, right? And I see this application of safety net. It's not an age sort of related issue, but it's for anybody who has people who want to live independently and fly, but everybody wants to put a little safety net so that in case anything happens, it's there, right? And that's not a conversation about dying. It's a conversation about living. And about these conversations, I mean, I've been an early advocate over Christmas. I want to say 2 years ago, I have read something about the Swedish death giving, which I thought was such a wonderful idea, which is this idea of sort of giving away things early, right? And my key component to that was, the reason why you have that is you want to start sort of thinking about how you want to live your life. Maybe part of it is being not burdened by certain goods, but it's a wonderful opportunity to have conversations. Those plates are not just about giving plates over to, your granddaughter, but it's about the stories that's behind them. So when you can still have the stories to discuss, right?
That's right.
And as part of that, you can have the conversation. It's not such I'm going to die, and so I'm going to give you all my plates. It's here's some plates that you might want to use because now you're in a prime of your life and having dinner parties. And so why not use these? And I got this with your grandfather when we were visiting London, right? And here's a story behind it. And so you're passing on the way you want to live, which is perhaps less burdened with certain goods, and then passing on the stories that everybody wants to have, because it's a story about living, and it's not about a story of giving away things because you're going to die. And so early conversations, bridging this gap, knowing that this gap exists, is the first sign of awareness. And then having those conversations about living, right, is the right way to put it.
Well, and I think one of the things that, as you're talking, I'm thinking that we've got all this technology, we've got our cell phones, right, and we've got the computers and the Zoom and a million channels to watch on TV, and I'm afraid that it kills our storytelling, and the being able to pass the stories are really, stories are so powerful in so many ways, but one of the most powerful ways to use story is to carry on family tradition and history. And that only happens if I sit with my children and my grandchildren and tell them stories. And some of them are going to be my stories, and some of them are going to be stories about my parents and my grandparents, right? And so this is so powerful. I like that.
And I think this caregiving conversation gap, again, is a wonderful opportunity to talk about living and stories. And, look, we look at things like putting in things, and people always ask, like, why put medicine reminder, and like, why this remote monitoring stuff? And my feedback is always like, I just remember my sort of experience between my mother and my grandmother, where it seemed like half the conversations they were having were less around storytelling and what they were doing and like stories that we can pass on to generations, and more like my mother nagging my grandmother, did you take your pills? Like, did you take your blood pressure? Did you do this? And the conversation became strained by what I would call the practicalities of like not just living, but not dying. Right. And so that's peppered and filled their conversations with those things versus things that were meaningful. And so the question would be, can technology come in and step in to take some of that type of what I would call sort of routine type of discussions and things that may be burdening our conversations with our family members to sort of do things and nag and do all of that type of stuff, do that on our behalf, and then giving us time to spend with our family. Not that we're going to supplant ourselves with AI robots that's going to talk to our family members for us, but that rather the technology and AI alleviates some of the stress of like caregiving that's, I think, more routine, allowing us to have these conversation gaps. And that's about storytelling and about passing on traditions and stories about, how I want to live and how I want to travel and all of those things, right?
Yep. So let's talk a little more specifically. We're coming up on our clock here, but what I'd like to do is I talked a little more specifically about how your technology helps claw back the time and energy to have those conversations.
Yeah, I mean, it literally, like I feel like my conversations, even with my mom as she was aging, was, that sort of craziness of, hey, did you take your pills? Hey, like, did you did you walk today to make sure that you got to walk, mom, because hey, your muscle's going to atrophy. You just sit around. Like, the technology is meant to basically say, like, look, I don't have to incessantly sort of ask these questions. Like, this data is available to me. And so if I see that there's a deterioration in terms of all of those things, and, I can work on and coordinate amongst ourselves, even who as caretakers, to say like, hey, mom won't listen if it's just one of us talking about it, right? I'm the one who nags all the time because I'm the primary caretaker and blah, 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 right? It's that the data is there. Everybody can see it. There's a coordination opportunity amongst everybody to sort of understand how to have that conversation and talk about the strategy of having that conversation, or even stop nagging and saying, mom, you could even see it yourself, right? So we just want you to have good health, and you didn't take your pills, right? Surprisingly, like, med adherence is like 48% for seniors. We know, and that's crazy talk, right? Because I mean, I don't know about other people, but I have blood pressure meds, I have statins, and I'm 53.
Yeah.
And so you can imagine how many more pills there are potentially as you're aging. And so that conversation takes up and populates 60 or 70% of a conversation overall. So the technology can help bridge that gap. It can actually serve as reminders to actually move more, do more, take your pills, and to sort of help us, not just, again, respond to emergencies, right? Which this is what typically medical alert products do, and that's what we do well. But let's talk about how to get you out of that cycle of just responding to bad things happening, but how to like stay active so you can, be more active for a longer period of time. And that's where I think the technology shift should be happening around, senior aging technology, right? Not just about responding to issues and like, patching up problems, but actually trying to be proactive about trying to resolve and get ahead of those problems.
Yeah, I love this so much because I do think that that's really, and we're going to see more and more of this, is the technology is going to allow us to claw back time, not big chunks, but little chunks. And those little chunks really add up, and to relieve some of the emotional burden that we all carry that we don't know what to do with. And when you can hand that off to technology, to a machine, that makes it better. So anyway, I thank you so much. Sort of last, just reminder us where to find you, what you do, and I can hardly wait till the next time you do this.
Well, thank you so much for the opportunity to chat with you again. So you can find us at LogicMark at www.logicmark.com. That's LogicMark.com. And you can find me on LinkedIn and Instagram. And my name is Chia-Lin Simmons at CHIA-LIN, and last name is Simmons, SIMMONS. So I do chat about all of these things and more on my own social, as well as on LogicMark. So please come and check us out and learn more about our technology and talk more about the world of aging and caregiving.
Perfect. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for watching. And Jada, of course, thank you for producing behind the scenes.
Thank you.